thanks for helping us do this.
Great.
We want to start by asking you a little bit about your background, about where you came from and your family of origin, and how you sort of got started in life.
Well, I was born in Atlanta, Georgia. Grew up in Atlanta. Always still think of Atlanta as perhaps as my home. I think it's always hard to when one thinks about their derivation and where they came from, I think one always thinks about their place of birth. And I still have family that lives in Atlanta, so I periodically go back there from time to time and see the city, although I'd be bereft if I didn't say that I think of Southwest DC as also my home as well now. In fact, I think that transition is pretty much in place.
Tell us about your family.
Well, I have, besides myself now, just my brother and I. Both my parents have deceased. I have several cousins, and I have an aunt who's still alive, and so that's the active family. And but for me, it was when we grew up as kids, it was always about family. It was always about church. It was always about going out. We used to always have several family events that we would go to, whether it was on my father's side or my mother's side of the family, and it was always a delightful. My parents both participated in all these events, and we enjoyed we used to go to all these events, particularly in the summer, where it would always be the big family reunions. My family has derivation from Savannah, which is, and so we would always go down for a big family event, and it was always kind of funny because although my last name is McBee, it doesn't sound very German, but that's my father's side of the family. We would go to these events, and we would be there, and there would never be anything of German descent at any of these events, and we used to laugh about it, but we assimilated so well into the culture. All of these food dishes were Italian or Polish or, something else, but we had very few. I think the only thing I could remember as a kid, we had sauerbraten. We had a few other dishes that were German, but by far and large, we were assimilated very well into different things. The culture was never an issue for us to broach across and to enter into other communities. In fact, where I grew up.
Parents native to Atlanta?
My father's from Savannah. My mother was from Atlanta, and so we always, the events were always around. Particularly then at that time, it was around food. It was around sports events. Atlanta at that time didn't have the sports teams they have now. In fact, it was more college oriented, and also we did have a couple of minor league baseball teams. The family lived next door to us, always went out to see the AAA baseball team play. They had tickets, and so I was always a tag along, and we used to go out and go to the games quite frequently. And so, it was mostly a family kind of atmosphere in Atlanta when I grew up. And certainly not that Atlanta was not the bustling town then as it is now, but it was always a town of people who came into Atlanta. It was always a nexus point where people would come in and be the regional sales manager. My cousin headed up a part of a company, and that was the regional office. He came out of Chicago, where the main headquarters were at. And so we always had a lot of people that were coming through Atlanta, would stay for a few years, go on to other parts in the South, or maybe go into other regions. So it was always a lot of changeover, much like it is here in the district, because we do have people who come here for a number of years. They're here for particular reasons with their careers, or they're here because of their politics. They're here while somebody that they've supported is here to look at a program and support that individual. So Atlanta is pretty much a typical southern city. So is D.C. I mean, when people talk about D.C. being a southern city, it truly, from my experience, having grown up in Atlanta, I can only just say yes, it is.
What about your grandparents? Were they Southerners as well?
Both my parents were all Southerners. In fact, my grandmother came from Savannah, And my grandfather actually came from Tennessee on my father's side. Both my grandmother and grandfather on my mother's side came out of the North Hills of Georgia up near Dahlonega. So that we were, always sort of stuck in our southern roots. I don't think we were going to go very far. I don't think there was a meal that wasn't served that we didn't have something that wasn't fried or grown in the backyard.
Were your folks Irish, Scottish?
Well, on my mother's side, we were definitely British. We were definitely, and then on my grandmother's side, we were German, and then my grandfather on my father's side was Scotch-Irish. So he actually worked in a foundry in Atlanta that did Pullman railroad cars. He worked on particularly doing the wheels. In fact, a good part of my family has to do with the railroad. And one of the reasons that Atlanta is where it's at, it used to be called Terminus, is because of all the major railroads. And after the turn of the century, all of the transportation started moving away from water onto rail. And so just like any, industry is big, a lot of my family, my father worked for Southern Railway, my aunt worked for Illinois Central, and my mother for a time worked for Southern Railway and then became an employee at Fort McPherson in Atlanta. And both my grandfather on my mother's side also worked for the railroad, Seaboard.
You'd mentioned church. What was your religious affiliation?
Well, we had an interesting family of affiliations because my grandmother was Lutheran, my mother was Church of God, my grandmother was Baptist, and so nobody, and then my aunt was Catholic. So we spent a lot of time in many different venues, going to many different events. And in fact, my family sort of settled in between, and we became Methodists for a while. So it was sort of a compromise between the Lutheran on one side of the family, and then the Baptist and Church of God on the other side.
So you grew up in a Methodist church?
Grew up in a Methodist church, yes.
What do you remember about it? What was it like?
Well, I think that the thing that I remember about the church experience was the Sunday school, because that was a kid. That was, what I remember about going to and meeting kids, because when I was at the church, I dealt with, then got to meet kids that didn't go to my school, but went in the community there. So it was another sort of family of people and friends that that were completely different from my school and away from my community in some ways, because we went to a church that was probably about 2 or 3 miles from our home. And so it was like this whole other set of people. And sort of when after my father died and we moved back to Atlanta, we lived in Birmingham, Alabama, I started in high school, which then I became full circle, because a lot of the kids that I had met in church, suddenly I was back in high school, and suddenly here were these other people I hadn't seen in about 8 years, 10 years. So it was interesting. And the other part about the church was always very much involved in the community. So there were always a number of events that, like with Halloween, there would be an event where people would come, the families, potluck, a lot of potluck activities. In fact, with the Lutheran church, my grandmother was one of the 2 people who actually ran the kitchen for the church. So that a lot of food in my family, lots of events, a lot of these potato pies. My grandmother loved to make these lemon pies for the church. So so food was a central component part for us and how we moved in our community.
What do you think were the real vital lessons that you learned from your family?
Well, I think one of the things that was important was to have humor, and humor is an important concept, and I think the other part was having respect for everybody in the community, because where I lived as a kid, there were both on my street which was predominantly white, but then next street up and over was predominantly black. And so when we would play baseball or softball, it would be all the kids coming together to play. And I can remember having my grandmother also ran the hospital orderlies for Crawford Long Hospital in Atlanta. And so I remember one day we were having a discussion, and we had an African-American black lady who came and helped with the ironing. And she would do the ironing for my grandmother and for our family. And because at that time you didn't have cleaners, you didn't go to the cleaners, you did all this yourself. And so I was talking about it, and I had used the word nigger. And my grandmother said, I don't ever
Important lesson, wasn't it? Were you close to your grandmother?
Well, let me give you a moment. I think that, when I used that word, she said, I don't ever want to hear you use that word. Yeah. And of course, at that time, she said, they are Negroes, and that was the term that was used. And she said, I don't ever want you to hear that. Said, we all deserve to be treated in the way we wanted to be treated. And that's all she said. That's all that needed to be said.
You never heard that from everybody.
But it was interesting. In my family, we didn't use that word. That wasn't a word that got used. But you did hear it in the community at times. And so and what you did was that you suddenly realized that those people weren't having respect for somebody else. Mm-hmm. And you stood back because you realized that I think the main value that I learned out of the church was about being human, about the fact that we're all faced with tasks as we live out our lives. We all have children, we have families, we have brothers, we have siblings, we have aunts and uncles. And regardless of whether we're pink, black, orange, that we have a family. And we're a group of families living together in communities. And I think that one of the things is that I know that there's jealousy. I know that there are a lot of people who don't get along. And I think we've all met people who we feel like we're oil and water with. But to target somebody just because of the fact that they can't speak English or because they don't look like you is not right. And that's one of the things I think as a kid that I learned. And the other thing was also about taking time to listen. Because I'm very much an extrovert, would love to be out there talking all the time. And I think that one of the attributes to learn is to listen, to hear what people have to say. It's an important thing, because we can talk all the time, but listen to what the other story is, what somebody has to say about themselves or bring to you is an important quality. And I think that's one of the things that another quality is trying to listen, trying to hear what somebody else is trying to tell you. Because it's all about communications as we meet one another. And I think that's one of the things that I'll always remember about being around my family, being around my grandmother, is this whole process of, slow down, listen, what's being talked about here, what's being said. You don't need to get angry, what's the, and so to slow me down. Because as a kid, you're just all full of energy, ready to go,
So you came of age in the 60s.
Yeah.
And in growing up an Anglo in the South, did your family talk about race, about ethnicity?
Oh, sure. And it was an important thing. I can, we were always involved in many different parts. I mean, I can remember, and particularly over my grandmother's community on my mother's side, working towards getting legal help for some of the people there in that community that were black, that were African Americans. That particularly, I remember this one lady. Can't think of her name right now, but I remember going down with my mother, going down to the city council, talking about how this lady had gotten cheated out of her property because she had needed some money and she had signed it. Actually, she had owned her house and signed it over. And so we were involved there to, to find out what can we do, how can we, this is a wrong that's being done in the community. And I remember a number of different things that happened along those lines where we all were, pulling together and working towards a common goal of our community, and not wanting to see, people in our community not treated right, not treated evenly and respectfully.
Do you think your family was exceptional in this way? Do you think that racism
I never looked at my family being exceptional in that way. I always thought that was just something you did. I always thought that was a quality that was there. I never really looked at it as being unique or.
But was not racism in Atlanta in the 60s the predominant mood?
But it was never as overpowering, because one of the things in Atlanta you have to understand is that there are more African American millionaires in Atlanta than any other city in this country.
But it wasn't always that way.
It's been very predominantly that way for a long time. A lot of the African American insurance companies are located in Atlanta. Atlanta's had a predominantly African American retail and commercial business down on Auburn Avenue, and that it's been a very strong focus in the community. Now, Atlanta is not unlike a lot of the northern cities, because there for a while, if you were Jewish, you lived in one part of town. If you were black, you lived in another part of town. If you were Italian, and it was sort of that way. But over a period of time, those barriers have actually dissolved away. And now what you see are economic barriers, economic realities of people. So it's people being divided by the economics of the situation. Can you live in this community because the houses here cost X? Or are you living over here in this community? I felt that the integration issue was sort of a moot point back in the 60s, because there was not a lot of fervent rhetoric except for a very few people. And those people, when somebody is squeaking loudly, those people get to be heard. It's oftentimes the other people who don't get to be heard, and we've heard that many different ways from many different people. I remember story that I sort of pops up is that one of the governors of the state of Georgia was very much a racist, and he used to run a restaurant called the Pickwick, and used to sell these axes. You would go to the Pickwick and get their axes. And I remember one time, my father, we went there, it was after church on Sunday, and we had gone there because they had sort of this buffet that you'd go through, and my father said, "I'm never going back here again." And and we were talking about it. He says, "This is not how I am and not how I feel we are as a family." So we never went back. It was just this, here we are, and suddenly you look around you and you see all of this going on. Now, was the rhetoric there while you were there? No, it was a very quiet kind of thing. This was when the civil rights were coming in. This is when the civil rights laws were being implemented, and this is where people who said, well, wait a minute, I'm a private owner. I should have the right to serve and pick and choose who I can serve and to. And so there was a lot of discussion on those levels, but eventually all of that just gave way. Atlanta, as I said, has always been sort of a melting pot, so there's always been this dearth of people coming in for a while and moving. And when you go to Atlanta, you're going to be lucky, just as you are here in Washington, D.C., to find a native Washingtonian. You will find it very hard to find a native Atlantan, because probably it only makes up maybe 20%, maybe 15% of the population there.
Tell us a little bit about your schooling experience.
Well, I was always good in school. I never had much problem. I think always felt it easy. Always had many interests in different part of the aspects, and I also thought that my family had was part of that, because they valued education, so that when I got a good report card, I'd come home, they might give me 50 cents for a B, you know what I mean, some kind of reward for grades. And they would always, my grandmother, you know, I'd have to take my report card up to my, you know, my grandmother or to grandparents when we'd go visit them, you know. So it was always, everybody was looking at the grades. And so it was, and I think part of that was an affirmation to do well is in itself. And I think one of the people probably that I can remember is Miss Davis, who I had in the second grade, who took the time because we lived not in walking distance of our elementary school, so we had this sort of plan in our community where at that time they didn't have buses. You had to be relying on somebody in the community to go pick you up or walk you home or walk you over. Well, we lived about 3 miles from the elementary school, so a little far to walk, although I think my father used to talk about how he had to walk 8 miles, you know, over the 8 years he was in school. So, so sometimes we'd have to wait after school to whoever was going to come and pick us up. And I can remember Mrs. Davis taking particular interest in us and, you know, and giving us books to read and to look at. I think the library, finding the library was the most wonderful thing that ever happened. You know, being able to go in and look at all these books, look at these resources. If you were interested in airplanes, guys, there was books on airplanes. If you wanted to go find out about, you know, mountains or you know, there were all these books. It was just right in front of you. You could go for it. And those were the two things I think that really had impact on schools. I think libraries are very important. So I really get upset when I think about how our library has been treated here in the district. I think that we do not have a good system that gets out, and I think it's one of the things that should be free and accessible to any and everybody.
What were your favorite subjects?
Well, my least favorite probably was English. I hated English. I hated to, I think it was the process of having to write something and then come back and read it again. It was like, oh, I don't want to, I hated that. But math, history, you know, geography, all those other things were pretty, you know, and probably math was the one that was the most fun. I liked the numbers, and then you could see what you've done. I got the right number. You knew that was the number.
What were the most important lessons that you came away from school with? How do you think your school really shaped you as a person and helped instill certain values that were prevalent later in life?
Well, I'm not sure about if I could just sort of pick out any one thing or values. I think I was pretty fortunate in that I went into schools that I was in. Our classrooms were fairly small. We weren't faced with some of the problems that we have today. And in fact, my graduating high school class was a little over 100 people. So it was a very small community. The school I went to was very much an urban school downtown in Atlanta. We had a very much a mixture of kids that came to school because the Washington Ballet School, all the kids that were involved in the arts came to my high school. And so, but also at the time, my high school had one of the highest VD rates of any high school in the country. We were very much this urban school sitting here, you know, right in this community. We had all of the problems, all of the things that go on now. We had knifings, we had well, I don't remember but one shooting while I was a kid, but it was more at that time, fights, getting knifed, getting cut. But I think out of that is that I was involved with a lot of people. It wasn't just people like, you know, I mean, it was like when you got out in life. There's a myriad of different people that you come in contact with. And I think the one big lesson that I learned was never get in a fight with a woman. Where guys like to think that they have the rules of combat, and we're going to duke it out, and we're going to sit here like these rules. A woman is, it is is only about one thing, and that's about winning. And it doesn't matter how we get there. And although I've never had a fight with a woman, but I can remember my first day after we moved back from Birmingham into to Atlanta, was going to high school. And there was this horrendous fight outside in the playground, and there was these two girls going at it, and all there was is clouds of hair flying. And it was like, oh my God. It was scary.
Was your school integrated?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. And as I said, it was probably one of the more progressive schools in that way, because of the fact that it was the downtown urban school, and it was also the school that that a large number of the arts community fed people into. So we had the ballet, we had the opera, we had, you know, and most of the programs there, like when in the summertime when they would bring in shows, well, all the shows that would come in would go to our high school for all the shows that would come in during the summertime would come through our school, because we didn't let out until late June. So a number of the programs, they would all come and use our facility for training. So, you know, it was, there were always a lot of things going on and people to meet. And we were very blessed, I think, with that situation. So, and I think the other part for me was that I've always was involved in student government. I never had a desire to want to be class president or that I can remember, but I always was involved in the student government activity with my class. And so I would be always involved with the issue around planning our class picnic. That was the big event towards the end of the year. Or we would have several dances during the year that would be that we would hold in the gym, things like that. So, and I think those are the things that I really remember. Those are things that sort of help you move forward once you get into life, because it's not for me, the lessons that I learned, it's not the big changes, it's the little changes, it's the little footsteps that you take. It's the progress you make towards a goal. Because oftentimes you get to a goal and you're going to find out that once you get there, it's not all of the things that you had hoped or have the solutions that you hope for. But the little steps as you go along allow you to redefine and refocus how you're going to get to that solution, and also looking at how that solution is going to work for you once you get there. You know, is that going to work for the community? Is that going to work for me? And so those are some of the lessons learned that I think that I got as a kid. And I think the other aspect that when my family moved from Atlanta to Birmingham, my father had gotten a position that required us to move to Birmingham in the Southern Railway. And so I found it so intriguing that once I moved to Birmingham, I was the outsider. Didn't matter if I was white. That wasn't the issue. The issue was I wasn't part of that community. I didn't grow up in that community. I was always going to be the outsider. I could remember having kids come up and pick fights with me, dumping my books, slapping up the back of the head. I was always going to be the outsider. And that was a lesson that took a while, that, here I was, and very much now, if you want to talk about Southern attitudes, Birmingham had a lot of Southern attitudes, and it was very much a town divided along racial lines. Atlanta never experienced that, and I think part of the reasons was that when you went to Birmingham, it was very much an industrial town. It was very much a town that was built along a blue collar, so that you would work in a job till you mastered that job, and then you might move up. And so it was very defined. It was also dominated, more than dominated, by the steel mills in that town, the steel industry. dominated that. And so it was the unions and the steel mills, and it was a very parochial environment. And so that if you didn't know how this worked, then you were suddenly cut off. I can remember going out for the football team and asking where we would meet. And the guy says, oh, we're going to meet at the field. Well, the field only happened to be 12 acres of land. So it was quite a big, large place to figure out where we're meeting in the field, you know. So, but you had to take your time. You had to, you know, and wait. And I think, you know, for me, that was a very hard thing to do, because I oftentimes find myself in my German temper getting in front of me and not wanting to wait.
How long did you live in Birmingham?
We lived in Birmingham for almost 5 years, so it was a long time. It was also an interesting time, because I remember as a kid, we would go on vacation, we'd go traveling, and we would have Alabama plates on our cars, and we'd be pulling into Mississippi or Tennessee or you know, Pennsylvania. I don't ever remember somebody saying, gee, you're from Alabama, what a great state. It was always like, I used to live in Alabama, I'm glad I don't live there anymore. That was one of the things that was like, so, you know, it's like, wow. I can also remember going down to Montgomery, Alabama as a kid, and seeing all of this poverty. It was so devastating to go to the state capitol, and there you are. And, you know, there are these shacks, basically, just right there. And you're looking at the State House, you're looking over here, and you're saying, something's wrong with this picture. There's something incongruous here. Not everybody is together here.
Mm-hmm. Tell me again, in your order, what order are you in for children in your family?
Well, I'm the oldest.
You're the oldest?
Yeah. So
and you had how many brothers?
Well, I had one younger brother who was a large age difference between us. There was 8 years age difference, which was really a hell of a, I thought I had the whole thing to myself there. I was ready to, you know, to say I was the only child. I loved it, and suddenly I had a brother who was 8 years. And so then to be 8 years old, 9 years, suddenly you're having to sort of babysit and lug him around and take care of him. It was like, hey, this isn't fair. What the darn? They said, I can't take him out here and drag him off here. We're going to go down in the woods, or, you know, go down to the creek. But I think, you know, it took a while to get over that jealousy for me. I think I took a while to, you know, allow him in, and now we have a very good relationship. And a very close relationship.
Where does he live now?
He lives in Atlanta.
Particularly in your high school years, I mean, you grew up in the 60s when the rebellions were brewing in this country. What about the counterculture or the political dissent that was brewing in that time, how did that influence you or affect you? Did you participate in?
Well, interesting enough for us, I think we were also counterculture, that was something that we could relate to, and that I think we wanted to be involved with. And so there was big efforts to be involved with that change. And you know, and also I think that it was a time where you were, I think, a natural time where you're breaking away and trying to become your own individual, which I think people do. They break away sort of from their family and look for your own roots. But at that time, because of its impassionment and what was going on, it was so hard to understand, because the rhetoric, the hatred didn't make sense. You just, you know, to hear the yelling and the screaming, and you know, and most of these people look like idiots. And so I think the things that we were more in, you know, when I say more, I don't say we were not more involved, but I think the things that we were looking at was, you know, how do we're more concerned about getting along. It was like, I remember one time being at an event where all of the black parents are on one side and all the white parents are on the other side, and you know, and they weren't staying together. But all the kids, we didn't have any problems. We were okay, and so I remember one time we had a big fight and nobody could tell who was in the middle of the fight, and all the parents coming out there, they were concerned about what was going on, you know, and they get down to the bottom of the pile and it was me and another guy, a white guy, having a fight. I guess they thought, you know, that somehow the kids, one of the black kids, instead were going to have a fight, but that was never the situation. It was never the situation, and I think that the animosity that you actually see in some of the northern cities was never that vehement in Atlanta, certainly, not that vociferous. Not to say there weren't elements. And one of the things that we obviously had during the 60s was, with the passage of the civil rights laws, became fair housing practices, which meant that anybody could buy a house. That was one of the issues, because my father worked for the railroad. He had people that worked for him that were black, that made good money. I remember him signing for, you know, helping somebody sign to get a note to buy a house. But one of the things that did happen at that time was suddenly we had this exodus out of the inner core of the city that moved out to the suburbs. Of course, nowadays, if you go to Atlanta and you talk to somebody and you talk about how you live in Smyrna, Georgia, they'd say, oh, it's downtown, or Marietta. You know, they don't look at that as being out in the burbs, but at that time, that was way out. And there was this tremendous exodus. Like where my grandmother lived, there was this exodus of people over in the West End part of town. But in that sort of 4 or 5 block community, 4 or 5 street community, they had nobody sell. It was interesting. They didn't go. I think it was, I don't know what, you know, it was, there wasn't this dire need, there wasn't this fear, there wasn't this, what was going to happen with the civil rights laws and how that was going to impact upon my family. And so I think some of those things were very sporadic in how they got played, and I think also how they get played out. I can remember you know, many different things that happened. I can remember where Reverend Martin Luther King got killed. And, you know, it was a very sad time. It was a very time, because Atlanta has always had, one of the things about Atlanta is it's always been a city wanting to have its golden feet or silver lining, but it's never felt like that it's ever measured up. And here we were having this funeral, and a lot of people being very concerned that it was done right, that it was done appropriately, it was done sensitively, and so those are the kind of things that actually got talked about in the community, about wanting to make sure that because I think in part that Atlanta's always felt like that they've only looked at the parts of the petticoat that they wanted to look at. They really have never seen the full dress.
That must have been a traumatic event. Were you in town for the funeral of Dr. King?
Yes, yes. And I remember having, I went to school at Emory, and there was a local bar, and we used to all go down to, and I remember going out, and one of our mutual friends there in the bar, who is a very interesting young man, who was African American. His father ran a college up in Connecticut, but he came to Atlanta looking for his black roots. He came to Atlanta looking for his African American side of his soul, his heart. And he turned out to be one of the people that was leading the mule through Atlanta for the cart for Reverend King. And so there's many stories that are kind of mixed up in this whole issue of trying to understand some of the racial issues that go on in one's community. And a lot of times I think the problem happens that we don't sit down to talk, because I do think that we're humans, that we all have emotions and feelings, and when we start acting on those emotions without understanding what we're doing, it becomes very hard for us to find solutions. We used to, when we lived in Atlanta, we used to, well, let's talk about different periods of different times of my life. But Atlanta always was a hot town, always lots of nightclubs. In fact, one of the things that I can remember, I thought, here's an interesting story for you that maybe you'll find amusing, but James Brown was my man. And so you could go in town and go see him, meet him, talk to him. Atlanta had this wide open nightclub, and it was, there were not the, nowadays there would be there would be a door charge. Well, back then, there were very few events that command a door charge. So if you went somewhere, it was usually for the price of a drink that you could go to a club. And the drinks at that time were $1.50, $2. Not like they are now, where they might be $10 for a drink. So it was, you're talking to somebody who's met Marvin Gaye, who is, I can go on, and and because the black music was such an integral part in my school, in my class, and growing up as a kid, I found it interesting that when I moved from Atlanta to Augusta, Georgia, that Augusta, Georgia was one of the crossover places for a lot of new songs and music to come out, because they were looking for those musical hits that would cross over for both communities. And I never really ever gave it any thought, because I always was listening to the black music scene. I think the other part too was that in the black community, that they were always the forefront in the fashion. I had a friend of mine, and his dad used to run a cleaners, and if you wanted to know what was happening, all you had to do is go to the cleaners and watch the black community as they came, particularly the guys and the girls. They were going, because they'd pick up their stuff on Friday afternoon to go out Friday night. I mean, you knew what was happening. You knew, what shirts to buy. You knew what pants. You knew how to dress. It was very clear, and that's still true today. I think that the black community has such a sense of style and awareness about that is just bereft, I think, in other parts of the communities. But let me finish now. When we used to go out, and I got a little older, so instead of going to the concerts and music and the clubs, I started camping. I started going out. I started hiking. Got very much involved in birding after I spent some time working at Road Atlanta doing sport car. So diverse. Sailing was the other thing. Taught sailing for a couple of years. Yeah. I moved here into the district in the late, early 80s. And I think the story that's interesting is that I lived in Old Town when I first came here. And I had a dog, I had a cat, I had an ex-wife at that time who I was married to. And we were looking for a place that we could have these animals. And so we were confronted. We lived in a townhouse there, rented an apartment, and the lady there got a contract with the Navy, and so we had to move. So we were trying to make the decision: do we move closer to the city, or do we move outside the city? Because we were desperately looking for a place that we could keep the animals. And we found this ad over here in Southwest DC where they said, we called them up and told them we had a pet. And when we came over, we were looking for the place, and we parked actually right here by the church, right next to the park, because we had to let the dog get out, walk around. And we both liked the park so much. We thought, God, this is great. How could you live downtown and have these trees, have all this greenery around you, but B, you could look up, there was the Capitol. I mean, you're right downtown. And we went over and interviewed, and actually it was kind of this bizarre process that we went through. We had to interview both with the wife, and then they accepted us, and then we all thought that was so bizarre to be, interview and got it, what's this stuff? I just want to rent a place to live, and in fact, we became so involved because my landlord says, well, gee, Ron, why don't you come to the board meeting? You can help with the landscaping committee. So I got it, even though I was a renter, I got involved with the landscaping committee, and then we decided that when one of the houses came up for sale, we bought. So we stayed there. And so it's one of the things I think about Southwest, that it has both a lot of attributes. The other part that I like about Southwest is it has, the history is here. And there's a lot of history. A lot of people look out and they look at the buildings in our community and they say, oh, I don't like that building. It looks ugly. It's all brick. But if you take a little time to know about that building and who built it and what's the story behind the building, or what was on that ground before that building was built, there's a lot of history. There's a lot of stories here in Southwest. And there's a lot of African American history here in Southwest, which has always amazed me, that the Black community hasn't been more involved in our community in terms of preserving some of those attributes that we have. I mean, it took me many years to learn the story about the Pearl. I think the Pearl is one of the things that we really should be honoring here, and it's a hell of a story. And it's also, I mean, there's many stories here. I mean, one of the things with the Old Friendship Baptist Church down the block here, I mean, this was a plot of Section B, the urban renewal area, that was bound to be torn down. That if you look around, there's not much else left because they tore everything down. But that congregation, that minister, Reverend Whiting, went out, talked to the RLL board, and convinced them that that church was important for the community here and to stay. He won.
Let's come back to more of that in a minute. But before we do that, tell us a little bit about your vocational life, your career. Where did you go after high school?
Well, after high school, I went into college, and of course, at that time, the Vietnam era, and at that time also, it was this bitter fight in this country. It was not only about the war, but it was also about racial politics as well. So a tremendous fight, getting involved, going down to Mississippi, doing some voter registration things, working just within the state of Georgia, actually. I mean, we had SNCC, who started in Atlanta. So, there were lots of people that were there, and it was an idea of a lot of ideas, a lot of people working towards making society better for everybody. Everybody. It wasn't about just one person, one entity. It was about the population, everybody being able to share together. And so it was exciting.
You went to Emory University.
Right.
What did you major in?
I majored in chemistry and biology. The idea for me was to, I was thinking about becoming a dentist. Actually, sort of what had happened was that I think if my father hadn't have died when I was 15, I probably would have taken a different bent along the way. But when I got accepted to school, I got accepted both at Georgia Tech, where I'd applied, at Emory, and a couple of other schools. But I knew that I didn't have the financial resources. I was going to have to go local. And so Emory was willing to give me a full scholarship. Georgia Tech was willing to give me a partial scholarship, and I was really into numbers, I was telling you about, with my background. And they were wanting me to come to summer school to take these courses. And I thought, well, gee, here's one school that really likes me so well and, and going to give me a full scholarship. And here's this other school who wants me to come to summer school and do this other. I said, gee, I think I'm going to go to the guys that give me more money and scholarship. So I started off in that vein. I think if my father my father had a penchant and an interest in buildings and architecture. And I think if perhaps, you know, if he'd lived, I think part of that would have, I'm sure, I'm almost positive I would have gone to Georgia Tech to become a civil engineer.
What was going on campus? Do you remember? I mean,
Well,
what year did you start college?
Yeah, well, I mean, the big thing that was going on was all about social programs and about, at this time, with the...
What year were you in college?
Well, I started in 65.
65.
Yeah, and so that the point being at that point in time was that there was all of this push for social programs, social changes. We were going to put poverty behind us, and it was really an exciting time. And then you had these very what I could term right-wing group of people who were very hawkish, who were, you know, this was the '68 Gorewater campaign, and so those were the things that were really teeming on the campus, and the focus was really on civil rights, individuals' rights, which I find amazing today that there is so little paid attention to one's individual civil rights. That back then, that was the focus. That was the salvo that everybody could get around, is that everybody had civil rights. And moving here, one of the big things that also happened when in the ensuing process that I moved here, a lot of people seem to forget there was this whole discussion about shadow government. And shadow government really has to do with all of that secret government that goes on with the CIA and that other parts that get funded. MITRE Corporation here, almost all of their funding, many people don't talk about it, but it all comes out of the Air Force. It's all, there is no process, because at the time for the Vietnam War, just like we have now with Halliburton and others, about all of this sort of this funding without any clear process to go through for holding it up to some, you know, peer process. How did that contract get there? Why are we doing this contract? Why isn't this contract out in the open? Oh, this is all about national security. We've heard that so many times before, and I think that with the Berrigan papers and other things that got released in those times, you found out, no, it's not really about that. There are other things being played out. And so that those were the important things that, to me, that I could remember. And if you look at the music at that time, it was also an expression, people wanting to express themselves and to reach out, to look at new ways of doing music. I mean, acid rock had not yet started. You know, it's a whole genre now. I mean, there are other art forms, and so it was people looking for new ways to express themselves, new ways to express their art form, their interpretations.
In the 60s, there was a lot of turmoil and a lot of conflict of priorities for some folks who were interested in political and economic equality and liberation. But then other folks who came from more privileged backgrounds were working on more self-discovery, you know, do your own thing, the whole free love movement. What was it in your experience? Was the 60s more about protest and political freedom, or was it the counterculture?
Well, I think it's a little of both. You couldn't go through those times without both of those things impinging upon you. I think that one of the things that, you know, I think I've talked a lot about the political process and what's kind of gone on in that venue, because it was in the political process was very much not only about equality, but it was also about accountability. But the process of the counterculture at the time too was, it was all about, there was this process of talking about love and loving one another, and talk about, you know, today begins the last day, you know, of your life. Well, sure, that's true. Every day we get up, you know, there's one day less that we're going to live, and it's very true. But the part for us, I think, that we learn a lesson is that I think in my small myopic community is that love can kill you, and a lot of times people will do things in the name of love that are really not about love, but about greed and about other things. And so that was one of the things that became very clear. It was about avarice, about people, you know, we as human beings are basically animals. We have different needs that we have, and part of some of this for us are different from other people. And it was never more clear in that period of time, because when is that some people are driven. Money was never an important issue in my family. It's not that we had money, it's just that there were other things that were much more important. You know, it was about the family. It was about sharing. If you had something, you shared it with somebody else in the community. I can remember when we used to go on our vacations. My dad loved to fish, and if he caught 2 fish, there was 1 fish that was going to go somewhere else. We were going to keep a fish. If we had 200 fish, he already had it planned out, that we were going to share this largesse, that was very clear. We started coming back to town. We wouldn't even go to our house. We'd stop on the way and drop off, he's got this fish, that, and that was really what was important. It wasn't about looking at your job and how much money you made. It wasn't about how much money you had in your checking account. Those weren't the important things that I can remember growing up that were the important things. It was really about people.
Tell us where you went from Emory.
I've got to remember myself how. Well, in Emory, I was in the service for a while, and got drafted just like a lot of other people during that period of time.
You were in the service?
I was in the service.
You were drafted?
Got drafted.
What year?
This is 70. So
part of the lottery?
Right, part of the process. And so here it was, boom, you're in the service, and pulled out of school, and so
What branch?
Army.
Army.
Yeah, and I can remember when I went down to report in my draft board, they were also that day drafting for the Marine Corps. I thought, oh my gosh, I don't think I want to be a jarhead, although I didn't. I had a good friend, and his brother was a Marine, but I just thought, I don't know, it didn't feel like me, and so became in the Army. Was very fortunate, I guess because of my education, my background. I got put into some military occupational specialty training, became a personnel clerk, went on to head up a medical hospital unit, a rehab facility that brought back people from Vietnam in Fort Jackson, South Carolina, where we had this hospital. And so part of the process there was managing these people who were coming back from Vietnam and had a plethora of different needs, not only medical needs, but had other particular needs too, about getting in touch with their family, about reconnecting, and things like that.